It was a warm July afternoon in Bakersfield, California. Traffic moved slowly along Highway 99, and the air smelled of dry dust and burnt rubber. At a gas station near the Edison Highway exit, a man with brown skin, a short beard, and deep, dark eyes was filling up the tank of a 2019 Toyota Corolla. He wore a crisp white shirt and neatly pressed navy blue slacks. He had arrived just 30 minutes earlier, parked carefully, paid in cash. He spoke to no one. He simply observed his surroundings with a calmness that seemed deliberate. His name was Karim Al-Mansour. In today's America, for many, that name alone was enough to raise suspicion. Racial tension, stirred by political rhetoric, international crises, and the persistent echoes of 9/11, was still deeply embedded in the cultural landscape. For some, the combination of brown skin, a foreign accent, and reserved behavior was all it took for everything else, respectability, legality, education, even citizenship, to be pushed aside. Karim knew this. That's why he spoke little. That's why he preferred to move alone. And that's why, when he noticed a Kern County Sheriff's cruiser pulling into the station and parking 2 cars behind him, he wasn't surprised. He lowered his gaze, kept his receipt, calmly closed the tank, and got back behind the wheel without breaking his rhythm. He had done nothing wrong. He owed nothing. But he also knew that didn't make him immune. Officer Darren Wilkes watched him from his patrol car, jaw clenched. A 38-year-old white man, stocky, with a history of internal discipline and several complaints of excessive force, none of which had ever stuck. He had been on the force for 14 years, and, although he never admitted aloud, he carried in his mind a very specific profile of what he considered suspicious. And Karim fit that profile perfectly. Wilkes had spotted the Toyota entering the gas station via a traffic cam at the intersection. There was nothing illegal about the maneuver, but something in his biased perception triggered an alarm. Why would a man like that, with that look, that demeanor, that clean, unadorned car, be driving alone through this area? Why pay in cash? Why so quiet? With no real cause, Darren fell back on the old rule. Better safe than sorry. When Karim started the car and headed for the exit, Darren turned on his cruiser's lights and followed. Less than a kilometer from the station, he signaled him to pull over. Karim complied without hesitation. Karim remained silent. He had been through this before, more times than he could count. Each time, he walked away from the encounter with a mix of indignation and resignation. It was the price of his skin, his name, his heritage. But this time, something was going to be different. Because this time, Karim wasn't just another citizen. He wasn't just an Arab man driving through Central California. He was part of a special FBI unit tasked with investigating institutional discrimination within law enforcement agencies. His job, his mission, was to document and expose incidents like this one. And what looked like a routine traffic stop was about to become solid evidence. What Officer Darren Wilkes didn't know was that Karim had a micro camera discreetly embedded in the dashboard, an authorized device recording both audio and video with court-admissible clarity. Everything was being captured. Every unfounded question, every subtle insinuation, every look. Even the radio exchange minutes later, when Darren mocked Karim's name and wondered aloud if he might be some distant cousin of bin Laden, was stored on the encrypted drive. In the end, with no legal grounds to detain him, Darren returned the documents and muttered begrudgingly, "You're free to go." Karim nodded silently. He put away the papers, started the car, and drove off with the same calmness he'd arrived with. There was no visible anger on his face, only resolve, because the real response, the meaningful one, wouldn't come there on the side of the road. It would come days later, in a federal building, under white lights with lawyers, witnesses, and recordings that didn't lie. At the FBI headquarters in Los Angeles, Karim submitted his report, along with the recordings. His job was done. The case was clear. What had occurred wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a preventive stop. It was a blatant and undeniable example of institutional racism. One more. And yet, something in Karim's expression as he closed the folder revealed that this wasn't a victory to him. It was just another entry in a long list. Because the problem wasn't one officer. It was an entire system that had taught men like Darren that suspicion was valid if the face looked Arab. That prevention justified humiliation. That ignorance was an acceptable tool of the trade. But Karim also knew, something he had learned over the years, and which now filled the pages of his case files, that justice doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes justice is patient, quiet, and shows up with a recording in hand and a truth that cannot be denied. At 9 a.m. the following Monday, in a conference room at the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. The files submitted by Karim Al-Mansour were under review. The recording was clear, uninterrupted. Every word, every pause, every condescending tone was there. It wasn't a matter of interpretation. It was direct evidence of a behavioral pattern. The difference between a routine stop and an act of open discrimination had been laid bare. Karim sat quietly as the legal team listened. He'd witnessed this process before, but familiarity didn't make it easier. Because, deep down, he knew the hardest part wasn't documenting racism. It was facing the indifference that often followed. The bureaucracy, the institutional instinct to shield itself. The audio reached the moment where Officer Darren Wilkes, unprovoked, made a sarcastic comment over the radio about how much that Arab must be hiding to avoid giving straight answers. The room went silent. A cold, heavy pause. One of those silences that signals discomfort, but also something deeper, recognition. At this time, there were no excuses to be made. "That's enough," said the lead investigator, an African-American woman with a serious expression, a clear voice, and eyes tired from having seen it all too often. "This is going to the Law Enforcement Conduct Review Commission." The process was launched immediately. Meanwhile, Darren Wilkes was still patrolling the streets of Bakersfield, unaware that every move he made since that day was now being monitored. The formal investigation hadn't yet been disclosed to him. The protocol required preliminary assessments, interviews, behavioral pattern reviews. What was at stake wasn't just his career. It was a system that, for years, had tolerated the behavior of officers like him. Karim, for his part, returned to his routine. He kept his cover, his official title as a private consultant, and continued his visits to various jurisdictions. His name didn't appear in public reports. His identity as an undercover agent remained strictly protected. Even within the Bureau, only a handful knew the true extent of his role. He didn't wear a badge. He didn't wear a uniform. But his influence ran deep, precisely because he operated where traditional oversight could not reach. Days later, when Darren was officially notified of the ongoing investigation, his initial reaction wasn't that of a man wrongly accused. It was the reaction of someone irritated at having been caught. He responded with anger, denial, and quickly began constructing his defense. He contacted his union, gathered his reports, spoke to his shift supervisor. He claimed he had acted out of caution, that the driver matched a suspect on a federal watch list, though he could never provide any details. But the evidence contradicted him at every turn. His written report contained no clear reason for the stop, no active warrants, no ongoing crime, just a series of personal judgments disguised as procedure. During the interviews, his narrative began to unravel. He claimed not to remember things clearly. He justified his actions with vague phrases. "Something just didn't feel right. I didn't want to take any chances. I was taught to trust my instincts." And it was precisely that instinct that was now at the center of scrutiny. The review committee began to examine Darren's full record, and what they found confirmed what was already evident. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were other complaints. Some had gone nowhere. Some remained in internal files. Others were dismissed for lack of evidence. But the pattern was there: unjustified stops of Latino individuals, racist comments during training sessions, repeated refusal to respond to calls for backup from black colleagues. It was a conduct the department had tolerated for years under the excuse of his operational effectiveness. For Karim, that was the most bitter part of the process, realizing it wasn't about a one-time error, but about an institutional culture that rewarded loyalty to bias over loyalty to principle. One afternoon, during a private session with a federal prosecutor, Karim made a remark that was more than just commentary. It was a verdict. Racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. And those whispers are the most dangerous, because the system mistakes them for common sense. As the investigation progressed, some within the department began to leak information. Small comments, hallway rumors, subtle attempts to discredit the validity of the case. The usual playbook. He probably overreacted. We don't know what happened off camera. There could have been more context. But the problem was that this time, the context was all on tape. There was no room for interpretation. The bias was documented. It was undeniable. And still, doubt began to creep into the upper levels. Some feared that making the case public would create tension within the force. Others worried that turning such a visible case into an example might harm morale. The same irony as always. Exposing racism was seen as more dangerous than committing it. Karim didn't attend those meetings. His role was technical. He delivered evidence, answered questions, never gave opinions. But his silence carried weight. When someone in the room suggested the case be quietly filed away as a minor infraction, all it took was Karim raising an eyebrow for the conversation to shift direction. Meanwhile, the local press began to catch wind that an internal investigation was underway. Although the details remained confidential, the fact that an officer with a disciplinary history was being audited for potential discrimination made headlines. The police union quickly came to Darren's defense, accusing the media of a witch hunt and the agency of betraying its officers. The pressure mounted, but this time it didn't work, because deep down, the Darren Wilkes case wasn't just about him. It was about hundreds of officers, shielded by their uniforms, who operated as if their power had no limits. It was about the impunity that grows out of vague policies and unchecked reports. It was about how suspicion becomes policy and policy becomes habit. Karim understood this better than anyone. He too had grown up in the United States. He had felt the stares, the airport screenings, the awkward silences in job interviews. He had excelled in school, passed difficult exams, mastered multiple languages. And yet, no matter how much he achieved, he always found himself facing the same mirror, the one that forced him to prove he wasn't a threat. As the case against Darren Wilkes moved through the internal channels of the FBI, the conversation began to reach higher levels. It wasn't just about whether the officer should be reprimanded, suspended, or terminated. It was about how the agency would handle the fact that one of its own undercover agents had been a direct victim of the very problem he was tasked with investigating. It was an uncomfortable mirror, and also a rare opportunity to do more than just file another report. The deputy director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division called for a special meeting with the supervisory committee. She didn't mince words. If we don't act decisively in this case, we're sending a clear message to every officer in the country that they can act on bias as long as no one's recording. And that is unacceptable. The gravity of the case had already reached federal attention. The Department of Justice began reviewing the procedures of the Kern County Sheriff's Office. The Congressional Human Rights Commission requested access to certain documents. What had started as a small incident on a dusty road in Central California was quickly becoming a national symbol. Karim watched the process unfold with a blend of professional detachment and personal investment. This was what he had always hoped for, to force the system to examine itself. But he also knew what that entailed. In moments like this, institutions tend to react with two opposing instincts: the instinct to protect themselves and the instinct to reform. Everything depended on which one prevailed. By mid-month, a private hearing was convened for Darren Wilkes. He was given the opportunity to testify under oath with legal representation. He accepted. His defense was clumsy and inconsistent. He claimed he couldn't remember key details, that he had followed protocol, though he couldn't specify which one, that the man seemed nervous, that his gut told him something was off. The federal prosecutor remained composed. He played back key segments of the video, the exact phrases, the silences, the stares, the offhand radio remarks. Every one of them contradicted the officer's story. Then, just when it seemed Wilkes had run out of arguments, his attorney made a move that stunned everyone in the room. He requested the identity of the citizen recorded, arguing that understanding his background and context was important. That was the moment everything clicked. The prosecutor looked at the defense attorney in silence for a few seconds. Then, he calmly placed a sealed folder on the table. The citizen in question is not just any citizen, he said evenly. He is part of this institution, a federal agent legally authorized to operate undercover in investigations of racial bias within police departments. Darren Wilkes turned pale. His lawyer went silent. No one in that room had seen it coming. What had started as a supposedly suspicious traffic stop was now revealed to be a covert test. And Wilkes had failed, irrefutably. In the adjoining room, Karim watched the hearing through a monitor. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply jotted something down in his notebook. Just another data point. Another confirmation of what he already knew. Prejudice doesn't hide behind arguments. It reveals itself through actions. Days later, the department issued an official statement. Darren Wilkes was suspended without pay, pending a final disciplinary hearing. But more significant was what followed. The FBI decided to make the case public. While preserving the agent's identity, they detailed the facts with precision. The statement was clear. Racial bias has no place in our law enforcement agencies. This case underscores the importance of having impartial internal oversight mechanisms. Instinct alone is not enough. We must rely on facts, on the law, and on the fundamental principle that all individuals deserve to be treated with dignity, without exception. The news spread like wildfire. Some conservative outlets try to downplay it. On social media, the case went viral. Darren Wilkes' name trended alongside hashtags like hashtag profiling and hashtag justice from within. But what truly made the difference was the response from within law enforcement. Some departments began requesting access to the internal review program Karim had led. Others sought guidance on implementing unconscious bias training. What had once been dismissed as unnecessary was now seen as unavoidable. 1 week later, at a conference hosted by the Institute for Ethics in Public Safety in Washington, D.C., a senior FBI official made an unusual statement. What happened in Bakersfield forced us to look in the mirror. Wearing the badge doesn't make you immune to bias, but it doesn't excuse it either. Our responsibility is twofold: to uphold the law and not distort it with our own beliefs. Karim was in the room. He wore a dark suit, no insignias, no name tags. No one knew he was the man behind the case. And that anonymity was what allowed him to keep doing his job freely. For him, anonymity wasn't just protection. It was principle. He wasn't after recognition. He was after impact. As the media continued to cover the case, Wilkes filed an appeal. But it went nowhere. The evidence was too strong. Eventually, he was dismissed from the force. His departure was quiet. No press conference. No farewell ceremony. Just an official notice and the surrendering of his badge and firearm. But what resonated most wasn't his downfall. It was the message his case left behind. That power, when misused, can and must be held accountable. That even those who enforce the law must themselves be subject to it. That for the law to have meaning, it must apply to everyone, including those who represent it. In the following days, Karim was assigned to a new case. A different state, a new name, a new situation. His work didn't stop. He knew there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Darren Wilkes across the country. Some obvious, others hidden behind the mask of professionalism, all with the power to shape lives in seconds. But he also knew something else, that every recording, every well-documented report, every firm but nonviolent action could serve as a counterweight, as a seed for change. Because racism isn't just a historical wound, it's a daily practice, and it can only be confronted with another kind of practice: active vigilance, structured accountability, constant action. Not to shame, but to correct. Not for revenge, but to teach. And in that silent, patient, deeply committed effort, Karim kept moving forward. A month after the case went public, in a closed-door meeting at FBI headquarters in Quantico, a new internal policy was officially approved. All patrol officers working with local agencies would now be required to attend mandatory training on racial bias, intervention protocols, and stop-and-search procedures. It wasn't the first time such a program had been attempted, but this time, there was a key difference. The training wouldn't be voluntary or symbolic. It would be based on real cases, on evidence, on facts, like those Karim Al-Mansour had documented. The Darren Wilkes case, now publicly archived in the Department of Justice records, became a study tool. It was included in police academies, university courses, and professional ethics seminars. For the first time in years, an undercover operation had not only led to disciplinary action, but had sparked a real conversation about policing, power, and prejudice. In Bakersfield, the impact was immediate. Local media followed the story for weeks. Some defended Wilkes, others supported his dismissal. But the biggest shift happened inside the police department itself. Officers who once joked openly grew quiet. Others, who had hesitated to speak out, now found space to do so. One of them was Officer Kevin Herrera, a Mexican-American with 8 years on the force. In an anonymous interview with a regional outlet, he said, "We all knew Wilkes had that attitude. We saw it, we talked about it. But no one did anything because, honestly, staying quiet was easier. This case showed us that someone really was watching, and that even those of us who think we're invisible, we have tools. We have a voice." That was the deepest change, not punishment but awareness. The deterrent effect, the realization that abuse, no matter how silent, is never truly unseen. Meanwhile, Karim was reassigned again. His undercover work kept him constantly on the move. This time, he was headed south to Georgia. A new name, a new identity, a new city. He knew what awaited him. New versions of suspicion, new skeptical faces, different shades of the same mistrust. But he also knew he wasn't alone, that the system, flawed as it was, had begun to acknowledge its own cracks. In a small roadside motel, the night before starting his next assignment, Karim went over his gear. He checked the cameras, tested the microphones, organized his files. The TV in the room played a national news broadcast. In one of the segments, they briefly mentioned the Wilkes case, now being cited as an example in a new legislative proposal aimed at regulating racial profiling by law enforcement. It wasn't law yet, but it was in Congress and in the United States. That alone was already a meaningful step. Karim didn't smile. He just turned down the volume, lay back on the bed, and closed his eyes. He'd seen it too many times. How change was announced with great fanfare and then slowly diluted in bureaucracy. But he also knew that this time, something had shifted. Days later, at a community center in Fresno, a group of young Latino students attended a civil rights workshop. Among the materials handed out was a pamphlet titled, "What to Do If You're Stopped Without Cause." It included clear instructions, procedures, legal contacts, and at the end, a new section, "Your Rights When Stopped for Racial Profiling." There, without names, the story was told of an Arab man stopped without cause who managed to trigger a federal investigation. The message was clear. You can document, you can report, you can demand respect. In a training room at the FBI Academy in Virginia, an instructor reviewed the same case with a group of new cadets. He explained how an undercover agent had used evidence to show how prejudice could disguise itself as routine and how that destroyed public trust in institutions. The law isn't instinct, the instructor said. It's a duty, and if we can't tell the difference between a gut feeling and a bias, then we're wearing the badge for the wrong reasons. Across the country, Darren Wilkes was trying to rebuild his life outside the uniform. He'd applied to 2 private security firms. Both rejected him. His record followed him. His name, linked to the case, appeared in the top search results. On some forums, his words were still quoted as a textbook example of what not to do. He lived under the weight of his reputation and the realization that his power had never been permanent. That authority, when exercised arrogantly, is fragile. A local reporter tried to reach him for an interview. Wilkes replied in a brief email, "I have nothing to say. I was set up." Even now, he didn't understand. And yet, the most striking part of this story wasn't his downfall, nor even the bravery of the man who recorded him. The most powerful truth was that justice didn't arrive with sirens or dramatic confrontations. It wasn't a chase. It was a meticulous act, planned, deliberate, patient. A truth captured on tape.